Frank straightened his tie, standing tall behind the glass doors of Royal Drive Autos, his kingdom. He prided himself on running a tight ship, where every minute counted and customers were either buying or leaving. No loitering, no nonsense. His mantra: "If you're not serious, you're wasting my time." That morning, a towering man strolled in, dressed casually in a hoodie and sneakers. Frank immediately sized him up. Too casual, not serious. The man, however, seemed unbothered by Frank's scrutinizing gaze, wandering around the luxury SUVs with a curious, deliberate pace. Frank's irritation bubbled as the man touched the vehicles, testing doors, peeking inside, as though shopping at a flea market. When the man approached him, Frank barely hid his annoyance. "Can I help you with something, buddy?" Frank asked, voice clipped. "Yeah," the man replied, smiling warmly. "These are nice cars. What's your financing process? How do you handle customers with different credit scores?" Frank arched a brow, folding his arms. "Why? Got bad credit?" The man chuckled, unfazed. "Just curious about your customer approach. You don't seem to have much traffic today." The comment struck a nerve. Frank's dealership had been struggling lately, and the last thing he needed was some random guy pointing it out. "Look," Frank said, stepping closer, voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "This isn't a library. Either you're here to buy a car, or you're wasting my time. Got it?" The man paused, clearly considering his response. "You know, I think you're misjudging me," Frank's patience snapped. "All right, I've had enough. Get out. We don't need window shoppers around here." Without waiting for a reply, Frank gestured toward the door, ushering the man out. The towering figure didn't resist, only nodding slightly before leaving. But as the man stepped outside, he turned back and gave Frank a look, not of anger, but of quiet disappointment. "Good riddance," Frank muttered under his breath, returning to his office. Not even 5 minutes later, the dealership's regional director arrived. Frank barely looked up from his desk as the sharply dressed woman strode in, her heels clicking loudly on the tiled floor. "Frank," she said curtly, her tone cold. "Can we talk?" Frank smirked. "What's this about?" "We're meeting targets this month." She didn't return his smile. Instead, she leaned in, voice low but firm. "The man you just kicked out? He owns this dealership. He's the new CEO of Royal Drive Autos." Frank froze. Every ounce of confidence drained from his face. His heart pounded, his palms grew clammy, and he could barely get the words out. "He owns the place?" The director didn't blink. "Yes. He's Big Shaq, our new owner. And you just embarrassed yourself in front of him." The room spun as Frank slumped into his chair, the weight of what he'd just done crashing down on him like a tidal wave. Frank sat in his office, staring blankly at the desk. The weight of the director's words echoed in his mind, relentless and unforgiving. He tried to rationalize it. How could someone like him own a dealership? The towering figure he dismissed as a nobody was actually his boss. His chest tightened as he replayed the incident in his mind, imagining the humiliation on Shaq's face. Whispers began spreading among the staff. A junior salesperson approached Frank hesitantly, her tone cautious yet firm. "You know, he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just asking questions. You didn't even listen." Frank shot her a sharp glance, but the truth in her words stung. He didn't listen, he never did. For years, he'd run the dealership like a one-man show, dismissing input from employees and treating customers like numbers. Now, it was coming back to haunt him. The rest of the day passed in silence, but the tension was palpable. Frank avoided eye contact with everyone, choosing instead to bury himself in paperwork, though his mind was elsewhere. That evening, he received a message, "Meeting with Big Shaq tomorrow morning. Be ready." His stomach dropped. Morning arrived too quickly, and Frank found himself in the conference room, hands clammy, knees bouncing under the table. When Shaq walked in, his presence filled the room. He wasn't just physically imposing, there was a quiet authority about him, a calm that unnerved Frank more than any yelling could. "You know why we're here," Shaq said, sitting across from him. Frank nodded but stayed silent. "Let me ask you something," Shaq continued. "Do you think the way you treated me was fair?" Frank hesitated, but under Shaq's steady gaze, he finally muttered, "No." Shaq leaned forward, his voice firm but not hostile. "That's not just about me. This is about how you see people. You judged me the moment I walked in. You didn't ask questions, didn't try to understand. You just assumed." Frank looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I made a mistake," he admitted. Shaq nodded. "You did. But here's the thing, I don't fire people for mistakes. I fire them for not learning from them." Frank's head shot up, his eyes wide. "You're not firing me?" "No," Shaq replied. "But I'm giving you a choice. You can walk away if you think this place is fine the way it is. Or you can stay and prove you're better than that moment. I want this dealership to set an example, for customers, employees, everyone. And I want you to lead that change." Frank swallowed hard, the weight of the challenge sinking in. "It won't be easy," Shaq added. "You'll need to face some uncomfortable truths. But if you're serious, I'll make sure you have the tools to succeed. What's it going to be?" Frank hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "Good," Shaq said, standing up. "You have 30 days. Show me what you can do." Shaq left the room, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts. This wasn't just a second chance, it was a test, one he couldn't afford to fail. Frank dove headfirst into the task, but the cracks in his approach became evident almost immediately. He began by skimming through articles on diversity and inclusion, thinking he could breeze through the challenge with surface-level fixes. However, when he rolled out a poorly thought-out training session for the team, the lukewarm response made it clear that no one was buying into his efforts. Employees quietly questioned his sincerity, and some outright avoided participating. The frustration mounted. "What does Shaq expect from me?" Frank muttered under his breath. His resentment toward the situation lingered, but as the days passed, he realized this wasn't just about completing a checklist. He was the one who needed to change first. Frank scheduled one-on-one conversations with his employees, starting with Julia, a senior salesperson who'd been overlooked for promotions despite her stellar record. She didn't hold back. "You don't value people like me, Frank," she said. "You see us as tools, not teammates. You've ignored ideas that could have helped this place grow. Maybe now you're paying attention, but it's going to take more than a few meetings to fix this." Her words hit Frank harder than he expected. For the first time, he was truly listening. That night, he replayed every conversation he'd had with his team. The realization struck him. This wasn't just about prejudice toward customers. It was about how he ran the dealership, how he made people feel small to protect his ego. Over the next 2 weeks, Frank immersed himself in the process. He brought in a professional diversity coach, someone who didn't sugarcoat the issues. Frank sat through sessions that forced him to confront his biases, his habits, and the blind spots he hadn't even realized existed. He started implementing changes that weren't just about checking boxes, they were meaningful. He created an employee feedback loop, giving staff an anonymous platform to share ideas and grievances. He updated hiring practices to focus on inclusivity and diversity. Most importantly, he changed how he communicated, prioritizing collaboration over command. Small changes added up. Julia, who had once doubted him, began to see a difference in how her ideas were welcomed and implemented. Customers noticed too. The dealership started offering personalized service to accommodate diverse needs. Frank even apologized publicly to his team, acknowledging his mistakes and pledging to do better. The apology wasn't perfect, but it was heartfelt, and that mattered more than he realized. By the 3rd week, the energy in the dealership began to shift. Employees who'd once felt sidelined now saw opportunities for growth. Customers who'd been turned away in the past started returning, this time treated with respect and understanding. Shaq paid an unannounced visit near the end of the month, walking through the dealership unnoticed until Frank spotted him. This time, Frank greeted him warmly, no longer seeing Shaq as an adversary but as someone who had given him a lifeline. "Looks like you've been busy," Shaq said, gesturing toward the buzzing showroom. "I have," Frank replied, smiling. "Still a lot to learn, though." "That's the right answer," Shaq said, a hint of pride in his voice. The final evaluation came sooner than Frank expected, though by now, he felt a cautious confidence. The dealership looked and felt different, less like a rigid machine and more like a thriving community. Employees were talking, laughing, and collaborating in ways they hadn't before. Customers lingered longer, chatting with staff who seemed genuinely invested in helping them. Frank led Shaq through the showroom, outlining the changes he had made. He didn't sugarcoat anything, acknowledging the rough start and admitting where things still needed improvement. "This isn't perfect," Frank said, "but we're moving in the right direction." Shaq listened intently, nodding but giving little away. As they moved into the back office, he turned to Frank and said, "You've done good work. But there's one thing I need to know. What have you learned?" Frank took a deep breath. "I've learned that leadership isn't about control. It's about trust, respect, and understanding the people you work with. I spent years thinking I was the smartest person in the room, but that just made me blind. I didn't see the talent around me. I didn't see people. Now I do." Shaq's expression softened, and for the first time, he smiled. "That's what I wanted to hear," he said. Over the next few months, the dealership became a flagship location for Royal Drive Autos. Employees like Julia stepped into leadership roles, mentoring newer staff and continuing to foster the inclusive culture Frank had started. Frank, meanwhile, became a vocal advocate for diversity within the company, sharing his story with other managers and encouraging them to confront their own biases. Shaq remained a regular presence, not as a watchdog but as a mentor. He encouraged Frank to think beyond the dealership, to consider how his leadership could influence not just sales but the broader community. Frank began working with local organizations, partnering with initiatives that supported underrepresented groups and finding career opportunities. Years later, the dealership's transformation became a case study for leadership and inclusion. Frank, once known for his arrogance and dismissiveness, became a symbol of what redemption and accountability could achieve. When asked how he managed such a drastic change, he often said, "It wasn't about saving my job. It was about becoming someone worth trusting." Shaq, too, saw his vision fulfilled. The dealership's success wasn't just in numbers. It was in the lives it changed, the opportunities it created, and the ripple effect it had across the industry. Frank stood in the showroom one afternoon, watching as a new customer walked in, a young man, nervous but hopeful, looking for his first car. Frank greeted him with a handshake and a genuine smile, listening carefully as the man explained his needs. As the customer left with his new car, Frank caught Shaq's eye from across the room. Shaq gave him a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they'd both come. Sometimes, Frank thought, the hardest lessons leave the most lasting impact. And the biggest mistakes lead to the most meaningful growth. Frank straightened his tie, standing tall behind the glass doors of Royal Drive Autos, his kingdom. He prided himself on running a tight ship, where every minute counted and customers were either buying or leaving. That morning, a towering man strolled in, dressed casually in a hoodie and sneakers. Frank immediately sized him up, too casual, not serious. When the man approached him with questions about financing and customer service, Frank's irritation bubbled. He dismissed the man as a time waster and ushered him out. The man left with a quiet look of disappointment. Minutes later, Frank learned the truth. The man he had just kicked out was Big Shaq, the new owner of Royal Drive Autos. Frank froze as the news sank in. His confidence drained, replaced by dread. That evening, a meeting was called with Shaq. Frank's anxiety was palpable as Shaq walked in with calm authority. "Do you think the way you treated me was fair?" Shaq asked. Frank admitted his mistake. Instead of firing him, Shaq gave him a choice: walk away or prove he could change. "You've got 30 days to show me you can lead this place the right way," Shaq said. Frank nodded, determined but unsure of where to begin. Frank began with surface-level changes, introducing basic training programs and diversity initiatives. The lukewarm response from employees made it clear that his efforts lacked sincerity. Frustrated, he scheduled one-on-one conversations to understand their perspectives. Julia, a senior salesperson, didn't hold back. "You don't value people like me," she said. "You see us as tools, not teammates." Her words stung, but Frank knew she was right. For years, he had focused on control, dismissing employees' input and treating customers as mere transactions. Now, he realized that the problem wasn't just his attitude, it was the culture he had built around him. Determined to do better, Frank immersed himself in workshops and sessions that challenged his biases. He partnered with a professional coach who didn't shy away from tough truths. Slowly, he began implementing meaningful changes. He established a feedback system for employees to voice ideas and grievances. Hiring practices were revamped to prioritize diversity and inclusion. Frank's own behavior shifted. He started listening, collaborating, and giving credit where it was due. Small victories began piling up. Julia noticed her ideas being implemented. Junior employees felt empowered to speak up. Customers, once wary, started returning, sensing the genuine shift in the dealership's atmosphere. The dealership's transformation wasn't without struggle. Frank had to confront resistance from some employees and grapple with his own ingrained habits. But as the weeks passed, the results were undeniable. Sales improved, not because of aggressive tactics but because customers felt valued. Employees began to take pride in their work, knowing their contributions mattered. Frank apologized to the team for his past behavior, a gesture that, though imperfect, carried weight. It was clear he wasn't just trying to save his job, he was trying to rebuild trust. Shaq returned unannounced near the end of the month. This time, Frank greeted him warmly, walking him through the dealership and outlining the changes. "This isn't perfect," Frank admitted, "but we're moving in the right direction." Shaq asked him what he had learned. Frank responded, "Leadership isn't about control. It's about trust, respect, and understanding. I didn't see people before. Now I do." Shaq nodded, satisfied. Over time, the dealership became a model of inclusion and leadership. Employees thrived, customers returned, and the once dysfunctional culture transformed into one of collaboration and respect. Frank took his lessons beyond the dealership, advocating for diversity and mentoring other managers. Years later, the dealership's story became a blueprint for others, showing how accountability and humility could drive meaningful change. Frank stood in the showroom one afternoon, watching as a young customer walked in nervously, searching for his first car. Frank greeted him with a handshake and a genuine smile, listening carefully. As the customer left, satisfied and smiling, Frank caught Shaq's eye from across the room. They exchanged a knowing nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey they had taken. Frank thought, "The hardest lessons leave the deepest impact. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes lead to the most meaningful growth." Frank stood at the dealership entrance, his posture confident, scanning the showroom floor like a general overseeing his troops. He thrived on efficiency and control, believing every transaction and interaction had to flow on his terms. That's why, when a tall man in a hoodie and sneakers approached him with questions about financing and warranty policies, Frank barely hid his disdain. "We're busy," he said curtly, motioning the man toward the exit. The man hesitated, visibly taken aback, before quietly leaving. Moments later, the regional director stormed into Frank's office. "Do you know who you just kicked out? That was Big Shaq. He owns this place now." Frank's stomach dropped. He replayed the scene in his mind, the dismissive tone, the way he hadn't even looked the man in the eye. Panic surged as he imagined what Shaq would do next. That evening, Frank found himself sitting across from Shaq in a tense meeting. Shaq's voice was calm but firm. "Do you think the way you treated me was fair?" Frank stammered out an apology, admitting his mistake. To his surprise, Shaq didn't fire him. Instead, he gave Frank an ultimatum. "You've got 30 days to prove you can lead this place the right way. Show me you're more than that moment." Frank started the next morning with what he thought were the right moves. He sent out emails about new training initiatives and diversity workshops. Employees nodded politely but didn't seem engaged. The energy in the dealership didn't change. Frank realized he was going through the motions, ticking boxes instead of addressing the deeper issues. Determined to do better, he scheduled one-on-one meetings with his team. Julia, a senior salesperson, didn't hold back. "You've been running this place like a dictatorship," she said. "You don't listen, you don't value us, and you only care about numbers." Her honesty hit Frank hard. For the first time, he saw how his leadership style had alienated his team. It wasn't just his treatment of Shaq that needed fixing, it was his entire approach. That night, Frank stayed late, poring over books and articles about leadership, inclusion, and communication. He decided to start from scratch, not with grand gestures but with genuine conversations. Frank brought in a professional diversity coach to hold workshops for the team, and he participated alongside them. The sessions forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his biases and blind spots. He implemented changes that made a real difference, creating anonymous feedback channels, revising hiring practices to prioritize diversity, and encouraging collaboration rather than micromanagement. Slowly, the dealership began to feel different. Employees who once avoided Frank started sharing ideas. Julia, once skeptical, saw her suggestions implemented, giving her a sense of ownership. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Frank had to navigate resistance from staff who were wary of his intentions. But he stayed consistent, proving his commitment through actions, not words. Customers began to notice the shift as well. Personalized service became the norm, and the dealership's reputation started to recover. Frank even issued a public apology to his team, acknowledging his past mistakes and promising to do better. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to show he was serious about change. Near the end of the 30 days, Shaq returned for an unannounced visit. Frank greeted him with a smile, walking him through the dealership and outlining the changes. "This isn't perfect," Frank admitted, "but we're building something better." Shaq nodded, impressed by the visible shift in the atmosphere. "What have you learned?" Shaq asked. Frank paused before replying. "Leadership isn't about control. It's about trust, respect, and understanding. I spent years running this place like a machine, but I never saw the people who made it work. Now I do." Shaq smiled, satisfied. Over the following months, the dealership continued to thrive, becoming a model for inclusive leadership. Employees like Julia moved into leadership roles, mentoring newer staff and fostering a culture of collaboration and respect. Frank became an advocate for diversity, sharing his journey with other managers and inspiring them to challenge their own biases. Years later, the dealership's transformation was celebrated as a case study in accountability and growth. Frank, once a symbol of arrogance, had become a leader who empowered others. As he stood in the showroom one afternoon, watching a young customer nervously pick out their first car, Frank greeted them with a handshake and genuine warmth. Across the room, Shaq watched silently, giving Frank a nod. Frank thought, "The hardest lessons leave the deepest impact. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes lead to the most meaningful growth." Frank stood at the entrance of the dealership, scanning the floor with sharp eyes. He was proud of the tight ship he ran, where efficiency reigned supreme and every customer was either buying or leaving. That morning, a tall man strolled in, wearing a hoodie and sneakers. Frank barely acknowledged him, immediately sizing him up as unserious. When the man asked about financing options and warranties, Frank cut him off. "This isn't a place to window shop," he said, gesturing toward the exit. The man hesitated before leaving silently, his expression unreadable. Minutes later, Frank was called into the office, where the regional director delivered the news. The man he just kicked out was Big Shaq, the new owner of Royal Drive Autos. Frank's stomach sank. He could barely process what he'd done. That evening, he sat across from Shaq in a tense meeting. Shaq's voice was calm but direct. "Do you think what you did was fair?" Frank stammered, apologizing profusely, but Shaq wasn't interested in excuses. You've got 30 days, Shaq said. Show me you're more than that moment. Prove to me you can lead this place the way it should be run. The next morning, Frank scrambled to make changes, sending out memos about new diversity initiatives and planning mandatory training sessions. Employees nodded along but remained skeptical. The atmosphere didn't shift. Frank realized he was only making surface-level moves, treating the challenge like a checklist. Determined to do better, he scheduled one-on-one conversations with his team. Julia, a senior salesperson with years of experience, didn't hold back. You've always treated us like cogs in a machine, she said. You don't listen, and you definitely don't care. If you want to fix this, you need to start by looking in the mirror. Julia's honesty stung, but it forced Frank to confront the reality of his leadership. That evening, he stayed late, reading about inclusive leadership and the importance of empathy. He realized his focus on control had blinded him to the people who made the dealership run. It wasn't just about the way he treated Shaq, it was about the entire culture he'd fostered. The next week, Frank brought in a professional coach to lead workshops on bias and inclusion. Unlike his initial efforts, this time he participated fully, sitting with his employees and facing the same uncomfortable truths. Slowly, he began to implement real changes. He introduced anonymous feedback forms, revamped the hiring process to prioritize diversity, and created opportunities for employees to take ownership of projects. Julia, who had been skeptical, started to see her ideas being taken seriously. The transformation wasn't without setbacks. Some employees resisted the changes, and Frank often found himself questioning whether he was doing enough. But as the days passed, the results spoke for themselves. Employees felt empowered, customers returned, and the dealership's energy shifted. Frank even stood in front of his team and issued a heartfelt apology, acknowledging his past mistakes and promising to do better. It wasn't polished, but it was sincere. Near the end of the 30 days, Shaq arrived unannounced. Frank greeted him warmly and walked him through the dealership, pointing out the changes. This isn't perfect, Frank admitted, but it's a start. Shaq asked him what he had learned. Frank replied, Leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about trust, respect, and seeing the people around you. I didn't see that before, but now I do. Shaq nodded, satisfied. Over the following months, the dealership continued to thrive. Employees like Julia stepped into leadership roles, mentoring others and fostering a collaborative environment. Frank became an advocate for diversity, sharing his journey with other managers and inspiring them to take accountability for their own biases. Years later, the dealership was celebrated as a model for transformation. Frank, once known for his arrogance, had become a symbol of redemption and growth. One afternoon, he greeted a young customer who nervously asked about buying their first car. Frank listened intently, offering guidance without judgment. Across the room, Shaq watched silently, giving him a nod of approval. Frank thought, sometimes the hardest lessons lead to the most meaningful growth. And the biggest mistakes can change everything for the better. Frank stood by the dealership doors, his arms crossed, scanning the showroom floor. He took pride in his no-nonsense approach. Efficiency was his mantra, and anyone who wasted time, employee or customer, was promptly shown the door. That morning, a tall man in a hoodie walked in. Frank didn't bother hiding his disapproval. The man wandered around before approaching Frank, asking about financing and warranties. Frank barely looked at him. This isn't the place to window shop, he said, motioning him toward the exit. The man left quietly, but not before meeting Frank's eyes with a steady, unreadable gaze. Minutes later, the regional director burst into Frank's office. Do you have any idea who you just kicked out? She asked, her voice sharp. Frank's stomach dropped as she continued. That was Big Shaq. He owns this dealership now. Frank's confidence evaporated, replaced by dread. That evening, Frank sat stiffly across from Shaq in a small conference room. Shaq's voice was calm but firm. Do you think how you treated me was fair? Frank stumbled through an apology, but Shaq cut him off. Apologies won't fix this, he said. You've got 30 days. Prove you can lead this place the right way, or we'll find someone who can. The next day, Frank scrambled to take action. He sent out a company-wide email announcing diversity training and revamped policies. Employees responded with polite nods but little enthusiasm. Frank quickly realized that his gestures, though well-intentioned, were superficial. Determined to dig deeper, he began scheduling one-on-one meetings with his staff. Julia, one of the dealership's top performers, didn't sugarcoat her feelings. "You've always treated us like numbers on a spreadsheet," she said. "You don't listen and you don't care. If you want us to believe this change is real, you'll have to start proving it." Julia's words stayed with Frank. That evening, he stayed late, reading about leadership, inclusion, and communication. For the first time, he saw the cracks in his approach. It wasn't just about the way he treated Shaq, it was about the culture he had built, one that prioritized control over connection. Frank realized he had to change himself before he could change the dealership. Over the next few weeks, Frank took concrete steps to rebuild trust. He brought in a professional diversity coach to lead workshops, and he participated alongside his employees. He established anonymous feedback systems and revised hiring practices to ensure inclusivity. Employees like Julia began to see their ideas implemented, and for the first time, the team felt heard. The changes weren't just policies, they were a shift in mindset. Frank listened more, collaborated openly, and stopped micromanaging. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. Some employees were skeptical of Frank's intentions, and progress was slow at first. But as days turned into weeks, the atmosphere began to shift. Customers started noticing, too. The dealership felt warmer, more inviting, and sales began to climb. Frank's apology to his team, though awkward and imperfect, marked a turning point. It was clear he wasn't just trying to save his job, he was genuinely trying to earn their trust. By the end of the 30 days, Shaq returned unannounced. Frank greeted him with a steady handshake, no longer consumed by nerves. As they walked through the dealership, Frank pointed out the changes he had made, from the new mentorship program to the employee-led initiatives that had taken off. "This isn't perfect," Frank admitted, "but it's a start. I've learned that leadership isn't about control, it's about trust and respect. I used to think this place ran because of me, but now I see it runs because of them." Shaq nodded, a faint smile on his face. "That's what I needed to hear," he said simply. Over the following months, the dealership continued to thrive. Employees like Julia stepped into leadership roles, mentoring newer staff and fostering a culture of collaboration. Frank became an advocate for diversity within the company, sharing his journey with other managers and encouraging them to examine their own biases. Years later, the dealership was celebrated as a case study in leadership transformation. Frank, once known for his arrogance and rigidity, became a symbol of accountability and growth. One afternoon, he greeted a nervous young customer who was shopping for his first car. Frank listened intently, offering advice and reassurance. Across the room, Shaq watched silently, giving him a subtle nod of approval. Frank thought, "The hardest lessons are the ones you never forget. And the biggest mistakes can lead to the most meaningful change."